Some mistakes follow you to the grave, haunting every quiet moment until you can barely look at yourself in the mirror. For mountain man Jeremiah Stone, that mistake has a name and a face he can never forget. 3 years ago, he killed Samuel Hayes in what he thought was justified revenge. Now he lives alone in the Colorado wilderness, carrying guilt heavier than any burden a man should bear. His days are spent trying to outrun memories that won't fade. But the past has a way of finding you, especially when it comes knocking at your cabin door. When 6-year-old twins Moses and Mary Hayes appear on his doorstep, hungry and desperate, asking the man who killed their father to help them survive, something breaks inside Jeremiah's hardened heart. What could possibly drive these innocent children to seek help from their father's killer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pine trees surrounding Jeremiah Stone's cabin, but no light could penetrate the darkness that had settled in his soul 3 years ago. He sat on his porch, nursing a cup of bitter coffee that had grown cold in his weathered hands, watching the mist rise from the valley below. At 43, his once proud shoulders now carried the weight of regret like a yoke that never lifted. The cabin itself reflected his state of mind, sturdy but worn, functional but without warmth. Built with his own hands after the war, it had once been a place of refuge and pride. Now it felt more like a prison he'd constructed for himself, far from the judgment of civilized society. The single room held only the necessities: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, though he rarely had company, a stone fireplace that provided more comfort than he felt he deserved, and a narrow bed where sleep came fitfully when it came at all. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his table, wrapped in an old cloth, lay a tarnished Civil War medal, the only remnant of the man he used to be. Captain Jeremiah Stone of the Colorado Volunteers had earned that Bronze Star for valor at Glorieta Pass, leading his men through hell itself to secure victory for the Union. Back then, he'd believed in justice, in right and wrong, in the nobility of fighting for a cause greater than himself. The medal had once represented honor, courage, the best of what a man could be. Now he couldn't bear to look at it. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the war, Jeremiah had tried to settle into civilian life, working as a lawman in various frontier towns. But the violence he'd witnessed, the friends he'd lost, the terrible necessities of war, they followed him wherever he went. When the nightmares became too frequent and the whiskey too necessary, he'd retreated to these mountains, telling himself he was seeking peace. What he'd found instead was Samuel Hayes. The memory struck him like a physical blow, as it did every morning when his mind was clear and unguarded. October 15th, 1870, a date burned into his consciousness. He'd been in Cedar Ridge for supplies when word came that outlaws had robbed the territorial bank, killing a clerk and wounding 2 others. The description matched a man who'd been causing trouble around the territory. Samuel Hayes, they said. A dangerous man with a reputation for violence. Jeremiah closed his eyes, but that only made the memory more vivid. He tracked Hayes to a cabin much like his own, following the moonlight through the trees. The confrontation had been brief, brutal. Hayes had reached for his gun when Jeremiah called out his name. In the darkness, with adrenaline coursing through his veins and the ghosts of war whispering in his ear, Jeremiah had done what he'd been trained to do. He'd fired first. Samuel Hayes had died instantly. The silver pocket watch in his vest stopping at 11:47 p.m. It was only later, much later, that doubts began to creep in. The stolen money was never found. Hayes' behavior in those final moments, surprise rather than guilt, confusion rather than defiance. The way he'd called out, "Wait," before reaching for his weapon. But by then, it was too late for second thoughts. Samuel Hayes was buried, the case was closed, and Jeremiah had retreated to his mountain exile with the thanks of the law and the weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest like a gravestone. The town of Cedar Ridge lay 15 miles down the mountain. close enough that he could make the journey for supplies, but far enough that he could avoid the complications of human society. It was a typical frontier settlement, a main street of weathered buildings housing a general store. Saloon, church, and sheriff's office, surrounded by the homes and dreams of people trying to carve civilization from wilderness. Most of the residents were decent folks, miners, ranchers, storekeepers, and their families, all working to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. But like most frontier towns, Cedar Ridge had its darker elements. Men who asked few questions about each other's past, who settled disputes with violence, who saw the law as a suggestion rather than a commandment. It was a place where a man could disappear if he needed to, where justice was often swift and final, where the difference between hero and villain could be decided by whoever told the story. Jeremiah had heard whispers over the years, fragments of conversation in the general store, remarks dropped by the few visitors who made their way to his cabin. Samuel Hayes had left behind children, they said. Twins, a boy and a girl, barely more than babies when their father died. Their mother had passed during childbirth, leaving them orphaned by Jeremiah's bullet. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, growing heavier with each passing season. He'd tried to learn more, to understand what had become of them, but his inquiries had to remain subtle. A man couldn't ask too many questions about the children of someone he'd killed without raising suspicions. What he'd pieced together painted a grim picture. The children had been shuffled between reluctant relatives and charitable families, never quite welcome, never quite belonging. In a frontier society that was hard enough on adults, orphaned children, especially children whose father had died violently, faced challenges that would break many grown men. The guilt had become his constant companion, more faithful than any friend, more persistent than any lover. It whispered to him in the quiet moments, reminded him of his failure when he tried to find peace, poisoned every small joy he might have allowed himself. He'd stopped attending church, stopped socializing in town, stopped believing he deserved anything better than this self-imposed exile. His daily routine had become a form of penance. Rise before dawn, tend to his small garden and the handful of chickens that provided eggs and the occasional meal. Hunt only what he needed, never for sport. He'd seen enough death. Repair and maintain his cabin with obsessive care, as if keeping his physical world in order could somehow organize the chaos in his soul. Read by candlelight in the evenings, mostly his father's old Bible and the few books he'd managed to acquire over the years. Histories, philosophies, anything that might help him understand how a good man could do such a terrible thing. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd become the very thing he'd once sworn to protect society from, a dangerous man living on the margins, armed and isolated, accountable to no law but his own troubled conscience. The badge he'd once worn with pride was long gone, traded for the lonely authority of judge and jury over his own actions. Winter was approaching, and with it would come the deep snows that would cut him off from town for months at a time. He welcomed the isolation even as he feared it, knowing that the long, dark nights would bring nothing but his own thoughts for company. He'd already laid in supplies for the season, got and stacked enough firewood to last until spring, prepared his small fortress against the elements and the world beyond. But he hadn't prepared for this. The soft knock on his door came just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, leaving the clearing in that gray twilight that made everything look like a dream. Jeremiah froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Visitors were rare at any time, but never after dark. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall beside his chair. The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "Hello?" A small voice called through the heavy wooden door. "Please, mister, we need help." Jeremiah's blood turned to ice water. A child's voice, thin with hunger and fear. He set down his coffee with hands that had begun to tremble, rose slowly from his chair, and approached the door like a man walking to his execution. Through the small window beside the door, he could see two tiny figures huddled together on his porch. Children, just as the voice had suggested, but the details remained unclear in the fading light. He hesitated with his hand on the latch, years of self-imposed isolation, warring with basic human decency. "What do you want?" He called through the door, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "We're hungry," came the reply. "And cold." "Please, mister, we don't have nowhere else to go." The words hit him like a physical blow. How many times had he imagined this moment? How many nights had he lain awake wondering what he would say if faced with the consequences of his actions? But imagination was a poor preparation for reality. He opened the door. 2 children stood on his porch, and even in the dim light, he knew immediately who they were. The boy and girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old, thin as winter saplings, dressed in clothes that had seen better seasons. But it was their eyes that struck him most. Dark, intelligent, and far too knowing for children their age. They looked up at him with a mixture of hope and wariness that spoke to experiences no child should have. The girl held a small rag doll clutched against her chest, its fabric worn smooth by countless nights of comfort-seeking. The boy stood slightly in front of his sister, already learning to be her protector despite his tender years. "Moses and Mary Hayes," the boy said with a dignity that nearly broke Jeremiah's heart. "You're the mountain man, ain't you? The one they call Stone?" Jeremiah couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely, and he felt tears, the first he'd shed in years, burning behind his eyes. These were Samuel Hayes's children, the orphans his bullet had created, and they were asking him for help. "Yes," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Jeremiah Stone." The boy nodded gravely, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. "Our daddy's dead," he said simply. "Has been for 3 years now. We heard you could help us." The tears came then, streaming down Jeremiah's weathered cheeks without shame or restraint. Here, on his doorstep in the gathering darkness of a Colorado evening, stood the living proof of his greatest failure. And they were asking him for help. "Please don't cry, mister," the little girl whispered, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "We didn't mean to make you sad." But Jeremiah couldn't stop. 3 years of guilt, of self-recrimination, of wondering what had become of these children. It all came pouring out of him in great wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. He sank to his knees on the porch, bringing himself to their eye level, and looked into the faces of Samuel Hayes's children. "I'm sorry," he whispered through his tears. "I'm so very sorry." The silence stretched between them like a chasm that no words could bridge. Jeremiah remained on his knees, tears still flowing, while Moses and Mary Hayes stood with the patient stillness that only children who have learned to wait for adult storms to pass can master. The little girl's rag doll seemed to watch him with button eyes that held no judgment, only the worn wisdom of a toy that had comforted through many dark nights. "We ain't eaten since yesterday morning," Moses said quietly, his small voice cutting through Jeremiah's sobs. "Miss Martha at the church gave us some biscuits, but that's all gone now." The practical need in the boy's words helped Jeremiah regain some measure of control. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and struggled to his feet, his knees protesting from the cold wooden planks of the porch. "Come inside," he managed, stepping back to give them room. "It's getting cold." The children hesitated at the threshold, exchanging a glance that spoke of hard-learned caution. They'd clearly been turned away from doors before, but hunger eventually overcame wariness, and they stepped into the warm glow of his cabin. In the better light, Jeremiah could see them more clearly, and what he saw made his chest tighten with fresh guilt. Both children were painfully thin, their clothes patched and repatched but clean. Mary's dress had been let down as far as it would go, but her wrists still showed beyond the sleeves. Moses's pants were held up with a rope belt, and his shoes were coming apart at the seams, but it was their dignity that struck him most forcefully. Despite their obvious need, they stood straight and proud, looking around his simple cabin with curious but respectful eyes. These weren't children broken by hardship. They were survivors, tempered by loss but not defeated by it. "Sit," Jeremiah said, gesturing to the rough wooden table. "I'll fix you something to eat." His hands shook as he prepared a simple meal from his stores, leftover venison stew from his supper, fresh bread he'd baked that morning, milk from his neighbor's cow that he bartered for with game meat. Simple fare, but nourishing. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at the children, searching their faces for traces of their father. Samuel Hayes had been a tall man with kind eyes and strong hands. Jeremiah remembered that much from their brief, fatal encounter. He could see echoes of the father in both children. Moses had his father's determined jaw and steady gaze, while Mary possessed what must have been Samuel's gentle nature. Despite the hardness that circumstances had forced upon her, "How did you find me?" Jeremiah asked as he set the bowls before them. The children attacked the food with controlled desperation, trying to maintain manners despite their obvious hunger. "Miss Martha told us about you," Mary said between careful bites. "She said you live up in the mountains and that you're a good man who helps people sometimes." The description sent a bitter laugh through Jeremiah's chest. A good man. If only Martha Henley knew the truth about what he'd done to these children's father. "Miss Martha's been real kind to us," Moses added. "But she's got troubles of her own, and the church folk." He paused, glancing at his sister. "Well, they got opinions about us staying in town." "What kind of opinions?" Jeremiah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The children exchanged another look, this one heavy with shared understanding of adult prejudices they were too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to feel. "Some folks don't think we belong," Mary said simply. "They say colored children bring trouble, especially ones whose daddy was—" She stopped, looking down at her bowl. "Whose daddy was what?" Jeremiah pressed gently. "A criminal," Moses finished for his sister, his young voice hard with defended pride. "They say our daddy was a thief and a killer, and that maybe we got bad blood too." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Here were these innocent children, bearing not only the burden of orphanhood, but also the weight of their father's alleged crimes that Jeremiah was increasingly uncertain Samuel Hayes had actually committed. "What do you remember about your father?" he asked carefully. Moses straightened in his chair, his thin shoulders squaring with dignity. "He was good to us. Used to tell us stories every night, teach us letters and numbers. He worked hard at the mill, saved every penny so we could have better someday. He weren't no criminal. People said he robbed the bank," Mary added quietly, "but Daddy was with us that whole day. We was sick with fever, and he never left our side. Mrs. Henderson from next door can tell you. She brought us soup and saw him there." Jeremiah's hands clenched around his coffee cup. If the children were telling the truth, and their sincerity was unmistakable, then Samuel Hayes had been innocent, which meant Jeremiah hadn't killed a criminal in the service of justice. He'd killed an innocent man, a loving father based on nothing more than circumstantial evidence and the word of others. "Where have you been living since—" He couldn't bring himself to say it. "Since your father passed?" "Different places," Moses said with the weariness of someone far older than his 6 years. "First with Aunt Ruby, but she got married and her new husband didn't want us around. Then with the Johansons for a while, but their farm failed and they couldn't afford to feed us. Been staying in the old Peterson shack outside town mostly, but winter's coming and it ain't got no heat." "You been living alone?" "Without any adults." Mary nodded, absently stroking her rag doll's yarn hair. "Moses takes care of me real good. He can hunt rabbits sometimes, and I can cook if we got something to cook. But it's getting too cold, and the snow's coming." The thought of these two small children facing a Colorado mountain winter alone, in an abandoned shack, was more than Jeremiah could bear. But taking them in would mean facing his guilt every day, looking into faces that resembled their father's, and carrying the weight of his crime in a way that solitary guilt could never equal. "Why did you come to me?" he asked. "Of all the people you could have asked for help, why choose—" He stopped, unable to voice the truth. Moses looked at him with those two knowing eyes. "Miss Martha said you was a good man who'd been hurt by the war, and that sometimes good men do things they wish they hadn't. She said maybe you'd understand what it's like to carry something heavy." The boy's wisdom was devastating in its innocence. Martha Henley, bless her heart, had sent these children to him, thinking he might relate to their burden of loss and displacement. She had no idea that he was the very source of their suffering. She also said, Mary added quietly, that you was the one who killed our daddy. The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples of silence that seemed to go on forever. Jeremiah felt his heart stop, then begin beating so hard he was sure the children could hear it. She said you didn't have no choice, Moses continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. That Daddy drew his gun first and you was just doing your job keeping folks safe. She said sometimes good men got to do hard things. Jeremiah stared at them in amazement. These children knew he had killed their father, and yet they had come to him for help. Either they were far more forgiving than any adult had a right to expect, or they were more desperate than he had imagined. You know what I did, he said slowly, and you still came here? Yes, sir, Moses replied, because Miss Martha said you was sorry about it, and because we ain't got nowhere else to go. Mary leaned forward slightly, her small hands folded on the table. We don't blame you, Mr. Stone. Daddy always said that sometimes bad things happen to good people and that holding on to anger just makes the hurt worse. We got to survive, and being mad at you won't feed us or keep us warm. The simple wisdom of it, delivered in a 6-year-old's clear voice, broke something fundamental inside Jeremiah's chest. These children had already learned lessons about forgiveness and survival that many adults never mastered. They had looked their father's killer in the eye and chosen mercy over revenge, pragmatism over pride. I don't know if I can, he began, then stopped. What was he going to say? That he couldn't help them? That his guilt was more important than their survival? That his comfort mattered more than their lives? We don't need much, Mary said softly. Just somewhere warm for the winter. Moses can chop wood and hunt, and I can cook and clean. We won't be no trouble. Looking at their hopeful faces, their careful dignity, their quiet desperation, Jeremiah realized that he had no choice. These children needed help, and whether he deserved redemption or not, they deserved a chance to live. He could continue wallowing in his self-imposed exile, or he could do something meaningful with the guilt that had been consuming him. You can stay, he said quietly. For the winter, at least. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The relief that washed over their young faces was painful to witness. They had been carrying burdens no children should bear, and for the first time in who knew how long, they could set those burdens down. But as Moses and Mary smiled at him with gratitude that felt like knives in his heart, Jeremiah wondered if he had just made the best decision of his life or the worst mistake he could imagine. The first morning with the children brought challenges Jeremiah hadn't anticipated. He woke before dawn, as usual, but the soft sound of breathing from the corner where Moses and Mary slept on a makeshift bed of blankets stopped him short. For 3 years, his mornings had begun in solitude, with only his guilt and the mountain silence for company. Now his cabin held the precious, fragile presence of the very lives he'd damaged most. Moses was already awake, watching him with alert eyes that seemed far too mature for a 6-year-old face. The boy had positioned himself between Jeremiah and his sleeping sister, a protector, even in unconsciousness. Morning, Jeremiah said quietly, unsure of the protocol for this new situation. Morning, sir, Moses replied, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking Mary. I can make the fire if you want. I'd done it plenty of times. The offer was practical, but Jeremiah heard the deeper message. I can earn my keep. I'm not just a burden. The thought that this child felt the need to prove his worth made Jeremiah's chest tighten with fresh guilt. I'll handle it, Jeremiah said, moving to stir the coals in the fireplace. You get some more sleep. But Moses was already sitting up, carefully extracting himself from the shared blankets without disturbing Mary. I don't sleep much past sunrise, he said matter-of-factly. Daddy always said early birds catch the best worms. The casual mention of Samuel sent a familiar stab through Jeremiah's heart. He busied himself with building up the fire, trying to process the strange reality of caring for the children of a man he'd killed. Every reference to their father was a reminder of what he'd stolen from them. Yet their easy acceptance of his help suggested a resilience that both amazed and humbled him. As the flames grew stronger, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Jeremiah found himself stealing glances at the sleeping girl. Mary looked even smaller in sleep, her rag doll clutched against her chest like armor against the world. The doll itself was a masterwork of careful mending, patches layered upon patches, stitching and restitching that spoke of countless nights of comfort-seeking. Mary made that doll herself, Moses said, noticing his attention. Well, mostly. Daddy helped with the hard parts, but she picked out all the fabric scraps and learned the stitching. Named her Hope. Hope, Jeremiah repeated softly. Yeah, Daddy said even when things get real bad, we got to keep hope alive. So Mary made sure she'd always have some to hold on to. The simple wisdom of it, a child creating her own hope in fabric and thread, brought tears to Jeremiah's eyes. He turned away, pretending to adjust the fire while he composed himself. What about you? He asked him. What did your father teach you? Moses was quiet for a long moment, and when Jeremiah looked back, he saw the boy's hands absently patting his shirt pocket. Daddy gave me this, he said, pulling out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a small, tarnished silver pocket watch, the same watch Jeremiah had seen in Samuel's vest that terrible night. The sight of it nearly brought Jeremiah to his knees. He remembered the exact moment the watch had stopped, 11:47 p.m., October 15th, 1870. The moment Samuel Hayes had died. He said, "Every man needs to know what time it is," Moses continued, unaware of the devastation his words were causing. Not just clock time, but the right time to speak up, the right time to stay quiet, the right time to fight, and the right time to forgive. Said this watch would help me learn the difference. Jeremiah's hands were shaking again. Does it still work? Moses's face fell slightly. No, sir. Been broke since the night Daddy died, but I keep it wound anyway, just in case. Sometimes I pretend I can hear it ticking, like maybe Daddy's time ain't really over, just waiting for the right moment to start again. The child's hope was devastating in its purity. Here was Samuel Hayes's son, carrying his father's watch like a talisman, still believing in the man's goodness, despite what the world had told him. And here was Jeremiah the killer, being trusted with that sacred memory. Tell me more about him, Jeremiah heard himself say. Your father. What was he like? Moses brightened considerably, and over the next hour, as Mary continued to sleep and the mountain morning grew brighter outside the windows, Jeremiah learned about Samuel Hayes the man, rather than Samuel Hayes the alleged criminal. He'd been a mill worker, honest and hard-working, who'd taken the job to support his children after their mother died in childbirth. Every evening he'd come home covered in sawdust and exhaustion, but he always had time for stories, lessons, and the small rituals that made a house into a home. He'd taught Moses to whittle, to track animals, to read the weather in cloud formations. He'd helped Mary with her letters, encouraged her artistic endeavors, and praised her cooking attempts, even when they resulted in barely edible disasters. He was saving money, Moses said proudly. Had a little tin box under the floorboards where he put away every extra penny. Said someday we'd have enough to buy our own place, somewhere with good soil for a garden and maybe a cow for fresh milk. He showed me the spot where he hid it, said if anything ever happened to him, I should remember where it was. What happened to the money? Jeremiah asked, though he suspected he already knew. Gone, Moses said simply. When we went back to get our things after the funeral, somebody had already been through the house. The box was empty, and most of Daddy's stuff was missing too. Folks said probably his criminal friends took it, but Daddy didn't have no criminal friends. He barely had any friends at all, on account of being so busy taking care of us. Another piece of evidence that Samuel Hayes hadn't been the man the law had painted him as. Jeremiah made a mental note to look into who might have cleaned out the dead man's belongings. Though he suspected the trail would be long cold after 3 years, Mary stirred then, blinking sleepy eyes and instinctively reaching for her doll. When she saw Jeremiah and Moses talking quietly by the fire, she smiled with the unconscious trust of a child who had slept safely for the first time in too long. Good morning, she said politely. sitting up and smoothing her dress with automatic dignity. "Morning." "Mary," Jeremiah replied, surprised by how natural the words felt. "Are you hungry?" "Yes, sir, but I can fix breakfast if you want. I know how to make eggs and biscuits." The offer was made with such earnest pride that Jeremiah didn't have the heart to refuse. He watched, amazed, as the 6-year-old girl moved through his kitchen with practiced efficiency, cracking eggs into his iron skillet and mixing biscuit dough with hands that were small but skilled. "Daddy taught me," she said, noticing his attention. "Said a lady should know how to feed her family proper. He was going to teach me pie making next, but—" She stopped, her small face clouding with remembered loss. "Maybe I could learn too," Jeremiah said gently. "I'm not much of a cook myself." Mary's face brightened immediately. "Really? I could teach you what I know, and maybe we could figure out the pie part together. Daddy said the secret was in getting the crust just right, but I never did learn that part." As they sat down to a breakfast of eggs and surprisingly good biscuits, Jeremiah found himself marveling at the resilience of these children. They had lost everything, parents, home, security, yet they faced each day with determination and even joy. They spoke of their father with love rather than bitterness, of their hardships as challenges to overcome rather than reasons for despair. But even more remarkably, they treated Jeremiah not as their father's killer, but as their benefactor. Their forgiveness was so complete, so unquestioned, that it felt almost supernatural. Whether it came from genuine grace or simple necessity hardly mattered. What mattered was that it was real, and it was changing something fundamental inside his guilt-hardened heart. After breakfast, as Moses helped clear the table and Mary carefully washed the dishes in his basin, Jeremiah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. "We need to get you some proper clothes," he said, "and school supplies, if you're going to be staying the winter. I'll take you down to Cedar Ridge later today." The children exchanged a quick glance, and Jeremiah caught a flicker of something. Worry. Fear? Before Moses spoke up. "That's real kind of you, Mr. Stone, but maybe it'd be better if we stayed up here. Some of the town folks, they don't take too kindly to us being around." "What exactly happened?" Jeremiah asked, sensing there was more to the story than simple prejudice. Mary's grip tightened on her doll. "Some men came by the old Peterson place a few days ago. Said we was causing trouble just by being there, and that colored orphans had no business in a decent town. They wasn't real friendly about it." The protective anger that rose in Jeremiah's chest surprised him with its intensity. These children had done nothing but exist, and some cowards had felt the need to intimidate them. It was exactly the kind of injustice that his younger self, the decorated war hero, would never have tolerated. "Well," he said, standing with new resolve, "those men are going to have to deal with me now. You're under my protection, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The gratitude in their eyes was almost unbearable, but Jeremiah held their gaze. For the first time in 3 years, he had a purpose beyond his own guilt, a reason to engage with the world, beyond his mountain retreat. These children needed an advocate, and whether he deserved the role or not, he was the only one they had. The ride down to Cedar Ridge was the first time in months that Jeremiah had ventured into town with any purpose beyond acquiring basic supplies. Now, with Moses and Mary riding double behind him on his steady mountain horse, he felt exposed in a way that went beyond simple social anxiety. Every person they passed would see him with Samuel Hayes's children, and questions would inevitably follow. Moses held the reins with confident hands, while Mary sat securely between them, her ragdoll tucked safely in her lap. Despite their earlier concerns about returning to town, both children seemed to draw strength from Jeremiah's presence. He represented something they'd been lacking: adult protection, someone willing to stand between them, and a world that had shown them little kindness. Cedar Ridge looked smaller than Jeremiah remembered, probably because he'd been avoiding its main thoroughfares for so long. The dusty street was busy with the usual frontier commerce, miners heading to and from the hills, ranch hands picking up supplies, families going about their daily business. Several people turned to stare as they passed, their expressions ranging from curious to disapproving. "That's the mercantile," Moses said quietly, pointing to a weathered building with a false front and painted sign. "Mr. Henderson runs it. He's always been fair to us. And there's Miss Martha's boarding house," Mary added, gesturing toward a two-story structure that looked more welcoming than most of the surrounding buildings. Jeremiah guided his horse toward the mercantile, but before they could dismount, a group of men emerged from the saloon across the street. Their leader, a well-dressed man with a gold watch chain and an air of self-importance, approached with purposeful strides. "Well, well," the man called out, loud enough for half the street to hear. "If it isn't the mountain hermit, and he's brought some interesting companions." Jeremiah dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and controlled. He recognized the man now, Clayton Marsh, one of the town's more prominent businessmen, and someone who'd always struck him as more politician than pioneer. "Marsh," Jeremiah acknowledged with a curt nod. "Stone," Marsh replied, his eyes fixed on the children who remained mounted. "Interesting cargo you're carrying. I thought these two had been told to move along." The casual cruelty in Marsh's tone made Jeremiah's jaw clench. "They're with me now." "That a problem?" Marsh's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Well, that depends. See, we've got a decent community here, good families, trying to raise their children right. Some folks might wonder what kind of example it sets, having those two running around unsupervised, especially given their parentage. Jeremiah's voice carried a warning edge that made several bystanders step back. "You mean being orphans?" "I mean being the spawn of Samuel Hayes," Marsh said bluntly. "That man was a thief and a murderer, and some folks worry that bad blood runs in families. We've got enough troubles without adding more." Moses stiffened behind Jeremiah, but the boy remained silent. Mary's grip on her doll tightened until her knuckles went white. Jeremiah felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had carried him through the worst battles of the war. "Samuel Hayes was never convicted of anything," Jeremiah said carefully. "He was killed before any trial could take place. Shot down like the dog he was," one of Marsh's companions added with ugly satisfaction. "Save the taxpayers the cost of a rope." The comment hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. These men were talking about Samuel's death as if it was something to celebrate, completely unaware that the killer they were praising was standing right in front of them. But worse than their ignorance was the pain it was causing the children. He could feel Moses trembling with suppressed anger, could see Mary fighting back tears. "Careful," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're talking about these children's father," Marsh shrugged dismissively. "Sometimes the truth hurts. Maybe if they learned that lesson early, they'd turn out better than their old man." That was the end of Jeremiah's restraint. He stepped forward, close enough that Marsh had to crane his neck back to meet his eyes. "Let me make something clear," he said quietly. "These children are under my protection now. Anyone who has a problem with them will have to deal with me." "And Marsh, you really don't want to deal with me." There was something in Jeremiah's voice, some echo of the soldier he'd once been, that made Marsh take an involuntary step backward. The businessman's face flushed with embarrassment at his retreat, but he was smart enough not to push further. "This isn't over, Stone," Marsh said, trying to salvage some dignity. "There are proper channels for these things. The territorial authorities will be interested to hear about this arrangement." "You do that," Jeremiah replied calmly. "I'm sure they'll be fascinated to learn that you're harassing orphaned children." Marsh and his companions retreated toward the saloon, muttering among themselves. But Jeremiah noticed that several other townspeople had gathered to watch the confrontation, and their expressions were mixed. Some seemed sympathetic to the children, others appeared to share Marsh's concerns. The situation was more complex than a simple case of bullying. "You boys can go on about your business," Jeremiah called out to the crowd. "Nothing more to see here." Most of the onlookers dispersed, but an older woman approached from the direction of the boarding house. She was small and grey-haired, with kind eyes and work-worn hands, clearly Martha Henley, the woman Moses and Mary had mentioned. "Mr. Stone, she said with a warm smile. "I'm Martha Henley. I believe we have some mutual friends." Jeremiah helped the children down from his horse, noting how they immediately moved to stand close to Martha. The affection was clearly mutual. This woman had been one of the few bright spots in their difficult lives. "Miss Martha," Mary said shyly, "Mr. Stone said he'd help us get through the winter. Did he now?" Martha's eyes studied Jeremiah with new interest. "That's very kind of you, sir. These children have been through more than any little ones should have to bear. They're good kids," Jeremiah said simply. "They deserve better than they've been getting." Martha nodded approvingly. "Indeed they do. Samuel Hayes was a good man, no matter what some people choose to believe. These children are his legacy, and they honor his memory with their courage and kindness." Her words sent another stab through Jeremiah's conscience. If Samuel had been as good as everyone who actually knew him claimed, then Jeremiah's crime was even greater than he'd thought. He'd killed not just an innocent man, but a genuinely good one. "We were just heading to the mercantile," he said, trying to steer the conversation toward practical matters. "They need winter clothes and school supplies." "An excellent idea," Martha agreed. "Education is the key to rising above circumstances." Samuel understood that. He was always working with them on their letters and numbers. As they walked toward Henderson's store, Martha fell into step beside Jeremiah while the children ran ahead, pointing out familiar sights and chattering with the first real excitement he'd seen from them. "You know," Martha said quietly, "there's been talk around town for years about what really happened the night Samuel died. Some folks never believed he was guilty of those crimes." Jeremiah's step faltered slightly. "What kind of talk?" "Well, for one thing, Samuel was home sick with his children the day of that bank robbery. Half the town can vouch for that. And for another, the money was never found. If Samuel had been the thief, where did it go?" The questions Jeremiah had been suppressing for 3 years came flooding back with renewed force. He'd acted on the testimony of men like Marsh, on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. What if he'd been wrong? What if Samuel Hayes had been completely innocent? "There's something else," Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel came to see me the night before he died. He was worried about something. Said he'd learned things about certain prominent citizens that they wouldn't want made public. He seemed frightened, Mr. Stone. That wasn't like Samuel at all." Before Jeremiah could respond, they'd reached the mercantile. But Martha's words followed him inside, adding new layers of complexity to a situation that was already testing every assumption he'd made about his past actions. Inside the store, Henderson proved to be a decent man who treated the children with kindness and respect. Moses was fitted for new pants, boots, and a warm coat, while Mary received a dress, proper shoes, and a beautiful blue hair ribbon that made her face light up with joy. Jeremiah also purchased slates, chalk, and primers for their education, along with thread and fabric so Mary could repair her doll properly. As Henderson tallied the purchases, he leaned close to Jeremiah. "Good of you to help them," he said quietly. "Samuel was a friend of mine. Worked an honest job, paid his bills, looked after those children like they were made of gold. Whatever people say about him now, I know the truth." Another voice supporting Samuel's innocence. Jeremiah paid for the supplies with a heavy heart, realizing that every person who had actually known Samuel Hayes believed in his goodness. The only ones who painted him as a criminal were men like Clayton Marsh, men who might have had their own reasons for wanting Samuel silenced. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, the children tired from their first real outing in months. But as they crested the ridge that led to his cabin, Moses spoke up. "Thank you, Mr. Stone, for standing up to those men, and for the clothes, and for everything. We ain't had nobody do that for us in a long time." "Yeah," Mary added sleepily. "It felt good having somebody on our side for once." Their simple gratitude was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. These children had been so starved for basic kindness that his minimal effort seemed monumental to them. But their words also carried a weight of responsibility that settled on his shoulders like a mantle. He was all they had now. And whether he deserved their trust or not, they were depending on him to keep them safe in a world that had shown them precious little mercy. The question was whether a man who had made such a fundamental mistake about their father could be trusted to make better decisions about their future. 2 weeks into their new arrangement, Jeremiah discovered that caring for children was both easier and harder than he'd expected. Moses and Mary had adapted to mountain life with remarkable resilience, throwing themselves into daily routines with an eagerness that spoke to their relief at finally having stability. But it was the quiet moments that challenged Jeremiah most, when the children spoke casually of their father, when they displayed mannerisms that must have been learned from Samuel, when their innocent trust reminded him constantly of what he'd stolen from them. The morning ritual had become sacred. Moses would wake first, as always, and help build up the fire, while Mary prepared breakfast with increasing skill. Then they would sit together at the wooden table, sharing simple meals and planning their day. Jeremiah found himself looking forward to these moments, despite the guilt they carried, watching as the children's thin faces gradually filled out with proper nutrition and their eyes brightened with security. But it was during one of these peaceful mornings that their fragile sanctuary was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. The sound of hoofbeats approaching up the mountain trail brought all 3 of them to immediate alertness. Visitors were rare enough under normal circumstances, but with the children present, every stranger represented potential trouble. Jeremiah moved to the window, his hand automatically checking the rifle that leaned against the wall. A lone rider was approaching, a big man on a tired horse, his clothes dusty from hard travel. As he drew closer, Jeremiah could see that he was black, probably in his 30s, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. But it was the set of his shoulders and the determined expression on his face that made Jeremiah uneasy. "Moses, Mary," he said quietly, "go to the back room and stay there until I tell you it's safe." The children obeyed without question, but Moses paused at the doorway. "Is it trouble?" he asked, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd learned to expect the worst. "I don't know yet," Jeremiah replied honestly, "but better safe than sorry." The rider dismounted with the careful movements of someone who'd been in the saddle for days. He was tall and powerfully built, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the cabin and its surroundings. When he knocked on the door, it was with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Jeremiah Stone," the man called out. "My name's Isaiah Hayes. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Hayes. Jeremiah's blood turned cold. This had to be Samuel's brother, the one Martha had mentioned in passing. He opened the door slowly, keeping his body between the visitor and the room where the children were hidden. Isaiah Hayes was an impressive man, with the kind of quiet strength that came from hard work and harder choices. His resemblance to the children was unmistakable. He had Moses's determined jaw and Mary's intelligent eyes, features that must have run strong in the Hayes bloodline. "I'm Stone," Jeremiah acknowledged, his hand still resting on the doorframe. "What do you want?" Isaiah's eyes were hard as flint. "I want my brother's children. I've been searching for them for months, following rumors and dead-end trails. Heard tell they might be up here with the man who killed their father." The words hung between them like a challenge. Jeremiah could feel the weight of the man's grief and anger, could see in Isaiah's stance the coiled tension of someone prepared for violence if necessary. But there was something else there too, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that spoke to months of desperate searching. "Come inside," Jeremiah said finally, stepping back. "We need to talk." Isaiah hesitated at the threshold, his eyes scanning the cabin's interior. "Where are they?" "Safe," Jeremiah replied. "And they'll stay that way until I know what your intentions are." "My intentions." Isaiah's voice rose with indignation. "They're my family, my blood. My brother's children shouldn't be living with the man who made them orphans." The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Jeremiah forced himself to remain calm. "Maybe not, but they're here because they had nowhere else to go." Where were you when they were living in an abandoned shack, facing winter with no food or heat? Isaiah's jaw clenched. I didn't know. Samuel and we had words before he died. Stupid words about stupid things. I left Colorado, went to work the cattle drives in Texas. By the time I heard about what happened to him, the children had disappeared into the wind. I've been looking ever since. The pain in the man's voice was genuine, and Jeremiah found his defensive anger cooling slightly. Family disputes were common enough, especially between brothers trying to make their way in a hard world. But the regret in Isaiah's eyes spoke to a man who'd learned too late that pride was a luxury that could cost everything. Moses. Mary, Jeremiah called softly. Come out here. There's someone you need to meet. The children emerged from the back room with cautious steps, their eyes wide with uncertainty. But when they saw Isaiah, Mary gasped and ran forward, throwing herself into his arms with a joy that nearly broke Jeremiah's heart. Uncle Isaiah, she cried, her face buried against his chest. We thought you was never coming back. Moses was more reserved, hanging back with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust too quickly in adult promises. But Jeremiah could see the longing in the boy's eyes, the desperate need for family connection that no amount of kindness from a stranger could fully satisfy. Isaiah knelt to embrace both children, his large hands gentle as he held them close. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. We know you was working, Mary said, pulling back to look at his face. Moses kept saying you'd come find us eventually. Did he now? Isaiah looked at his nephew with new respect. You kept the faith, boy? Moses nodded solemnly. Daddy always said family was the most important thing, even when they disagree about stuff. He said you'd come back when you was ready. The simple wisdom of it, a dead father's confidence in his brother's fundamental goodness, seemed to hit Isaiah harder than any rebuke could have. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks as he pulled the children close again. Jeremiah watched the reunion with mixed emotions. Relief that the children might have a real family option warred with an unexpected sense of loss. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd grown accustomed to their presence, to the way they filled his cabin with purpose and warmth. The thought of returning to his lonely exile was more painful than he'd anticipated, but beneath those selfish concerns lay a deeper worry. Isaiah might be family, but that didn't automatically make him the best choice for the children's care. Jeremiah had seen too much of the world to believe that blood always trumped circumstance. We need to talk, he said to Isaiah. Outside, Isaiah nodded, understanding the need for private conversation. Moses, Mary, I want to hear everything that's happened to you. But first, let me and Mr. Stone have a word. On the porch, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the pines, the two men faced each other across a gulf of history and hurt. I know what you think of me, Jeremiah said without preamble. And you're probably right to think it. But those children in there have been through hell, and they deserve better than to be shuffled around based on adult guilt or convenience. Isaiah's expression was unreadable. You think I can't take care of them? I think caring and being able to care are two different things. Where would you take them? What kind of life could you offer? Better than this, Isaiah replied sharply. Better than living with their father's killer in some mountain hideout. Would it be? Jeremiah challenged. They're safe here. Fed warm, learning to read and write. They were starving when they found me, Isaiah, facing a Colorado winter in a shack with no heat. Where were you then? The question hung between them like an accusation. Isaiah's hands clenched into fists, but when he spoke, his voice was quiet with pain. I was being a fool, he admitted. Samuel and I fought about his choice to stay in one place, raise those babies alone instead of sending them to our sister in Kansas. I thought he was being stubborn, holding on to a dead woman's memory when he could have been free to start over. Said some things I wish I could take back. What kind of things? Isaiah looked out over the valley, his face etched with regret. Told him he was wasting his life, that those children would drag him down, keep him from making something of himself. Said maybe it would be better for everyone if he found them a proper family and got on with living. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jeremiah could imagine how those words would have hit Samuel, a widowed father struggling to do right by his children. Hearing his own brother suggest he should abandon them, "He threw me off his property," Isaiah continued. "Said I didn't understand what family meant, and that maybe I never would. I was too proud to apologize, too sure I was right. So I left for Texas, figured I'd let him cool down and come back when he was ready to listen to reason. But he died first. Yeah, he died first." Isaiah's voice broke slightly, and the last words between us were angry ones. "I can't fix that, Stone. Can't take back what I said or make up for not being here when they needed me. But I can try to do right by those children now." The raw honesty in Isaiah's confessions stirred something unexpected in Jeremiah's chest, recognition of a kindred soul carrying his own burden of guilt and regret. Here was another man haunted by his mistakes, another brother struggling to find redemption in service to Samuel's memory. "What would you do with them?" Jeremiah asked more gently. "Take them to Kansas, to my sister Ruth. She's got a good marriage, stable home, other children. They'd have family, schooling, a chance at a normal life. And you?" Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Maybe settle down myself, find work near Ruth's place so I can be part of their lives. Maybe finally learn what Samuel was trying to teach me about what family really means." From inside the cabin came the sound of children's laughter. Moses and Mary sharing stories with their uncle, reconnecting with the only family they had left. The sound was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. "They love you," Isaiah said suddenly. "I can see it in how they look at you, how comfortable they are in your home. Whatever else you are, you've been good to them." The observation was both generous and painful. "I've tried to be," Jeremiah replied. "But I'm not family. I'm just the man who gave them shelter when everyone else turned away," Isaiah finished. "That matters, Stone. That matters more than you know." As the sun began to set over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jeremiah realized that his simple winter arrangement with two orphaned children had become something far more complicated. The arrival of Isaiah Hayes meant choices would have to be made, sacrifices considered, and the fragile bonds they'd formed would be tested by the competing claims of guilt, love and duty. But looking at Isaiah's face, seeing the genuine love and regret there, Jeremiah began to understand that maybe, just maybe, Samuel Hayes' children might finally have a chance at the family their father had always wanted them to have. Isaiah stayed for 3 days, and in that time, Jeremiah watched the children bloom in ways he hadn't expected. The presence of their uncle, their father's own blood, awakened something in Moses and Mary that went beyond simple happiness. It was connection, belonging, the deep satisfaction of being claimed by family rather than merely sheltered by charity. But it was on the second evening, as they sat around the fire sharing stories of Samuel, that Mary produced something that changed everything. "Uncle Isaiah," she said softly, reaching into the small bundle of belongings she'd brought to the cabin, "I got something of Daddy's that you should see." From the bottom of her few possessions, wrapped carefully in a piece of faded cloth, she pulled out a folded letter. The paper was yellowed and worn, as if it had been handled many times, and Jeremiah could see that it was addressed in a careful, educated hand. "Daddy wrote this the night before he went to heaven," Mary said, her young voice steady but sad. "He gave it to me and said if anything happened to him, I should make sure somebody read it out loud so everyone would know the truth." Isaiah took the letter with trembling hands. "Oh, why didn't you show this to anyone before?" "We tried," Moses said quietly. "But every time we told grown-ups we had something important from Daddy, they just patted us on the head and said children shouldn't worry about adult things. Nobody wanted to listen." The casual dismissal of children's testimony was typical of frontier society, but in this case, it might have prevented justice from being served. Isaiah unfolded the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the contents with growing amazement. "My God," he whispered. "Samuel, you clever fool, what does it say?" Jeremiah asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Isaiah's voice was thick with emotion as he read aloud, "To my children, Moses and Mary, and to whatever decent soul might help them if I'm not here to do it myself. If you're reading this, it means my fears were justified and the truth needs telling. I'm not the criminal they say I am. I never robbed no bank, never hurt no innocent person, and never took a penny that wasn't earned honest. But I learned things about certain folks in this town that they'd kill to keep secret, and I believe my life is in danger because of it. The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to go on forever. Jeremiah felt his world shifting, the foundations of his guilt and self-loathing cracking under the weight of Samuel's testimony from beyond the grave. There's more, Isaiah continued, his voice growing stronger. I discovered that Clayton Marsh and Sheriff Calkins have been stealing from the territorial mine shipments for months, replacing gold with lead weights and keeping the difference for themselves. When I tried to report it through proper channels, I learned the corruption goes higher than I thought. That bank robbery everyone's talking about? Marsh staged it to cover the theft of territorial funds, and now he needs a scapegoat to take the blame. I believe they mean to kill me and claim I resisted arrest. If that happens, know that I died an innocent man, and that my greatest regret is leaving you children without protection in a world that's already shown you too little kindness. The silence that followed was profound. Moses sat perfectly still, his father's pocket watch clutched in his small hands, while Mary hugged her rag doll tighter. Isaiah stared at the letter as if it might disappear, and Jeremiah felt the last 3 years of his life reshaping themselves around this new truth. Samuel Hayes hadn't been a criminal. He'd been a whistleblower, a man who'd stumbled onto corruption and tried to do the right thing, and Jeremiah had killed him for it, becoming an unwitting tool in the very conspiracy Samuel had died trying to expose. The letter continues, Isaiah said softly. Samuel writes about how much he loved you children, how proud he was of your courage and kindness. He asks whoever finds this to make sure you know that every decision he made was to protect you and give you a better life. But Jeremiah barely heard the rest. His mind was reeling with implications that stretched far beyond his personal guilt. If Samuel had been innocent, then the real criminals were still free, still profiting from their crimes. Marsh's hostility toward the children made perfect sense now. They were living reminders of the man he'd had murdered. We have to take this to the authorities, he said finally. Isaiah looked at him with something approaching pity. What authorities? Samuel says in the letter that Sheriff Calkins is part of the conspiracy, and Marsh has money and influence. Who's going to believe the word of a dead man over living, respectable citizens? The harsh reality of frontier justice was that it often had little to do with truth and everything to do with power. A letter from a dead man might be evidence, but it wasn't proof, and the men it accused had spent 3 years consolidating their positions while Samuel's reputation was destroyed. Then what do we do? Jeremiah asked. Let them get away with it. Maybe, Isaiah replied pragmatically. Maybe the important thing now is getting these children somewhere safe and letting the past stay buried. But Moses looked up from his father's watch with eyes that burned with quiet determination. No, he said firmly. Daddy died trying to tell the truth. We can't just let the bad men win. You're 6 years old, Isaiah said gently. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is, Mary said, speaking up with rare assertiveness. It's our fight because it's about our daddy, and if we don't fight for him, who will? The simple logic of children, uncomplicated by adult fears and pragmatic calculations, cut through the room like a blade. These 6-year-old twins understood something that the grown men were struggling with, that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Even if we wanted to fight, Jeremiah said, how would we do it? Samuel's letter is evidence, but it's not enough by itself. We'd need proof, witnesses, something more substantial. Daddy says in the letter that he hid some papers, Mary said quietly. Evidence stuff that proves what the bad men were doing. He told me where he hid it in case something happened to him. Both men stared at her in amazement. Where? Isaiah asked, in the old mine shaft behind the cemetery. He showed me the place and made me promise to remember it. said it was our secret, and that someday it might help keep us safe. The revelation opened new possibilities, but also new dangers. If Samuel had indeed hidden evidence of the conspiracy, retrieving it could provide the proof needed to expose the truth. But it would also put them in direct conflict with men who had already killed once to protect their secret. "It's too dangerous," Isaiah said immediately. "If Marsh and Calkins suspect we know the truth—" "They already suspect," Jeremiah interrupted, thinking of the confrontation outside the mercantile. "Marsh has been trying to drive the children out of town since before I took them in. He knows they're a threat to his peace of mind, even if he doesn't know about the letter." The fire crackled in the silence as all four of them contemplated the weight of the decision before them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and reminding them that winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. "I say we get the evidence," Moses said with the simple directness of youth. "If it helps people understand that Daddy was good, then it's worth trying. And if it gets us killed?" Isaiah asked. Moses looked at his uncle with eyes far too old for his face. "Then at least we'll die trying to do right, just like Daddy did. That's got to count for something." The boy's courage was humbling, and Jeremiah felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. The call to action, the sense of purpose that had once driven him to take up arms for justice. Samuel Hayes had died trying to expose the truth. The least Jeremiah could do was finish what the man he'd killed had started. "We'll need a plan," he said finally, accepting the inevitable. "And we'll need to be smart about it. These men have had 3 years to cover their tracks." Isaiah looked at him with new respect. "You're really willing to do this? To risk everything for the truth about a man you—" He stopped himself before saying the words. "A man I killed," Jeremiah finished. "Yes, I think I owe him that much." As the evening wore on and they began to discuss the practical aspects of their impossible mission, Jeremiah realized that his long period of self-imposed exile was coming to an end. For 3 years he'd hidden from the world and from himself, nursing guilt like a chronic wound. Now faced with the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for Samuel Hayes's memory, he found the courage to step back into the light. The children had given him more than a purpose. They'd given him a chance to become the man he used to be, the man who fought for justice, even when the odds were impossible. Whether he deserved that chance or not was no longer the question that mattered. The plan they devised was simple in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. Isaiah would return to town openly, making no secret of his presence or his relationship to the children. His arrival would serve as both distraction and test. If Marsh and his conspirators were truly guilty, they would react to the presence of Samuel's brother with alarm and possibly violence. Meanwhile, Jeremiah would use the cover of Isaiah's presence in town to search for Samuel's hidden evidence. Mary had provided detailed directions to the old mine shaft, and her child's memory for important details had proven remarkably reliable. If the evidence existed and could be retrieved, they would have the proof needed to expose the conspiracy. But as they prepared to put their plan into action, an unexpected visitor changed everything. The knock came at dawn, sharp and insistent. Unlike the tentative tapping that had announced the children's arrival weeks earlier, this was the demanding rap of official authority. Through his window, Jeremiah could see 2 men on horseback, Sheriff Calkins and a deputy he didn't recognize. "Stone," Calkins called out. "Need to have a word with you." Jeremiah's mind raced. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Somehow, the sheriff had learned about Isaiah's presence or the children's situation. Either way, this visit spelled trouble of the most dangerous kind. "Isaiah, take the children to the back room," he said quietly. "Keep them quiet no matter what you hear." But as Isaiah moved to comply, Moses stepped forward with his father's letter clutched in his small hands. "Maybe we should show him," the boy said with heartbreaking faith in adult justice. "Maybe if he reads what Daddy wrote, he'll help us catch the bad men." The innocence of the suggestion nearly broke Jeremiah's heart. Moses still believed that law enforcement meant justice, that showing the truth to a sheriff would result in the right thing being done. He had no way of knowing that the man outside their door was one of the very criminals his father had died trying to expose. "Not this time," Jeremiah said gently, taking the letter from Moses and tucking it into his shirt. "Sometimes the badge doesn't make the man." He opened the door to find Sheriff Calkins flanked by his deputy, both men armed and alert. Calkins was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the kind of face that suggested too much whiskey and too little conscience. His badge gleamed in the morning sun, but Jeremiah now saw it as a symbol of corruption rather than justice. "Sheriff," Jeremiah acknowledged with careful neutrality. "Stone. Heard you've been playing house with some interesting guests." Calkins's eyes swept the cabin's interior, looking for signs of the children. "Mind if we come in?" "Actually, I do mind. This is private property and you don't have a warrant." Calkins' face hardened. "Don't need a warrant to investigate reports of vagrant children. Got a duty to make sure they're being properly cared for." "Reports from whom?" "Concerned citizens. Clayton Marsh, specifically. Says you've got Samuel Hayes's spawn up here, and some folks are worried about what kind of influence you might be having on impressionable young minds." The casual cruelty in calling the children spawn made Jeremiah's jaw clench. But he forced himself to remain calm, knowing that any show of anger would only escalate the situation. "The children are fine," he said carefully. "Well-fed, properly clothed, learning their letters and numbers. If Marsh has concerns about their welfare, he can file a formal complaint through proper channels." "Maybe I'll do that," Calkins replied. "But first I want to see them for myself. Make sure they haven't been subjected to any unnatural influences or inappropriate teachings." The veiled threat was clear. Cooperate or face trumped-up charges of child endangerment or worse. But before Jeremiah could respond, Isaiah emerged from the back room, his impressive frame filling the doorway. "Sheriff," Isaiah said with deceptive mildness. "I'm Isaiah Hayes, Samuel's brother. I think there might be some confusion about the situation here." Calkins' reaction was immediate and telling. His hand dropped to his gun, and his face went pale with what looked like genuine fear. The deputy, taking his cue from his superior, also tensed for action. "Hayes," Calkins breathed. "Heard you were in Texas." "I was. But family business brought me back." Isaiah's voice carried an undertone of steel that made clear he was not to be intimidated. "I understand there's been some confusion about my brother's children. I'm here to clear that up." "Are you now?" Calkins had recovered some of his composure, but his eyes remained wary. "And what exactly needs clearing up?" "Well, for starters, the circumstances of Samuel's death. Been hearing some interesting stories about what really happened that night." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Calkins's eyes flicked between Isaiah and Jeremiah, calculating odds and possibilities. When he spoke again, his voice carried a warning. "Your brother was killed while resisting arrest for bank robbery and murder. That's official record, witnessed and documented. Any man who suggests otherwise might find himself facing charges of interfering with justice." "Interesting," Isaiah replied calmly. "Because I've got a letter from Samuel, written the night he died, that tells a very different story." The effect of these words on Sheriff Calkins was dramatic. His face flushed red, then went white, and his hand actually moved to his weapon before he caught himself. The deputy looked confused, clearly not privy to whatever secrets his superior was protecting. "You're lying," Calkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Isaiah reached slowly into his coat, making no threatening moves, but keeping his eyes locked on the sheriff's face. "Would you like to read it yourself?" "That's enough!" Calkins snapped, drawing his gun with practiced speed. "Both of you, hands where I can see them!" The deputy followed suit, though he seemed uncertain about what was happening. Jeremiah raised his hand slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. This was escalating beyond anything they'd planned for, and with the children hidden just rooms away, the stakes couldn't be higher. "Easy, Sheriff," Jeremiah said carefully. "No need for guns. We're all reasonable men here. Reasonable men don't make accusations against duly elected peace officers," Calkins replied. but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. And they don't harbor evidence in capital crimes. What capital crimes? Isaiah asked with deceptive innocence. I thought we were talking about my brother's death, which you said was justified self-defense. The verbal trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Samuel's death had been justified, then there was no capital crime to hide evidence about. By mentioning capital crimes, Calkins had just revealed that he knew there was more to the story than the official version. Calkins realized his mistake the moment the words left his mouth. His face went through a series of expressions, anger, fear, calculation, before settling into cold determination. You know what? He said finally. Maybe it's time we settled this once and for all. Deputy Morrison, go get the children, sir. The deputy looked confused. The Hayes children. They're hiding in the back room. Bring them out here. Sheriff, I don't understand. Do it! Calkins roared, his composure finally cracking completely. As the deputy moved toward the back room, Jeremiah made his decision. Whatever was about to happen, he couldn't let innocent children be caught in the crossfire. He stepped sideways, putting himself between the deputy and the door. That's far enough, he said quietly. Move aside. Stone, or I'll move you myself, Calkins warned. His gun now pointed directly at Jeremiah's chest. No, the single word carried 3 years of guilt, weeks of growing love for 2 orphaned children, and the accumulated weight of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. Jeremiah looked into Calkins's eyes and saw not a peace officer, but a cornered criminal, desperate and dangerous. You killed Samuel Hayes to cover your crimes, Jeremiah said with sudden clarity. You and Marsh have been stealing territorial funds, and Samuel found out about it. So you set him up, spread lies about him being a bank robber, then sent me to kill him for you. Calkins's face was a mask of rage and fear. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? You manipulated me into becoming your weapon, turned me into a killer to protect your secret. But it's over now, Calkins. The truth is going to come out. The hell it is, Calkins snarled. The only truth that matters is what's written in the official records. And tomorrow morning, those records are going to show that Isaiah Hayes and Jeremiah Stone died while resisting arrest, and that 2 orphan children tragically perished in the fire that destroyed Stone's cabin. The naked threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. This was no longer about justice or law enforcement. This was about survival, about corrupt men willing to murder children to protect their secrets. But as Calkins raised his gun to carry out his threat, Moses Hayes stepped out from behind the cabin's corner, his father's pocket watch gleaming in his small hands. Sheriff, the boy said with heartbreaking politeness, I think you dropped something. In his other hand, Moses held Sheriff Calkins' badge. Somehow, in the confusion and movement, the boy had managed to slip it from the man's vest. The symbolism was profound, a child literally stripping the false authority from a corrupt lawman. Calkins spun toward Moses with murderous intent, but that moment of distraction was all Isaiah needed. Moving with the fluid grace of a man who'd learned violence in harder places than Colorado mining towns, he struck like lightning, disarming the sheriff and deputy before either could react. As the guns clattered to the ground and the 2 lawmen found themselves facing the wrong end of their own weapons, Moses walked forward and carefully pinned Calkins's badge to Jeremiah's shirt. There, the boy said with satisfaction. Now you're the sheriff, and you can arrest the bad men just like Daddy wanted. The badge felt heavier than any medal Jeremiah had ever carried. As he looked down at the tin star pinned to his shirt by Moses's small hands, he understood that the boy had given him more than a symbol. He'd given him the authority to finish what Samuel Hayes had started, but authority without proof was just another form of corruption. And Jeremiah knew they needed Samuel's hidden evidence to make any accusations stick. With Calkins and his deputy now securely bound with rope from Jeremiah's supplies, they had bought themselves time, but not safety. The men would come looking when the sheriff failed to return, and those men would be armed and dangerous. We need to move fast, Isaiah said, checking the ropes that held their prisoners. Calkins won't be the only one in on this conspiracy, and when he doesn't report back, Marsh will send more men. Jeremiah finished. Probably claim we're outlaws who attacked a lawman. By tonight, we'll have bounty hunters and vigilantes combing these mountains. Mary emerged from the cabin, her rag doll clutched tightly against her chest. Despite the morning's violence, she moved with the calm determination of someone who had learned to function in crisis. "Should I get the directions to Daddy's hiding place?" she asked practically. "Yes," Jeremiah replied, amazed once again by the children's resilience. "And anything else you think might be important." As Mary disappeared back inside, Moses approached the bound sheriff with curious eyes. "Why did you kill our daddy?" he asked, with the direct honesty that only children possessed. Calkins glared at the boy with unconcealed hatred. "Your daddy was a troublemaker who didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. He was trying to help people," Moses replied with simple dignity. "That's what good people do." "Good people?" Calkins laughed bitterly. "Boy, your daddy cost me and Clayton more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. All because he couldn't mind his own business." The casual admission of guilt was shocking in its openness. Calkins had apparently abandoned any pretense of innocence, perhaps believing that dead men tell no tales and that Moses's testimony would soon be silenced forever. Isaiah stepped closer to the sheriff, his face hard as mountain granite. "How much money are we talking about?" "Enough to retire comfortable," Calkins replied with defiant pride. "We've been skimming from territorial mine shipments for 2 years. Small amounts, nothing anyone would miss if they weren't looking for it. Your brother got suspicious when the assay reports didn't match his mill receipts. The confession painted a clear picture of systematic theft. Samuel, working at the mill where ore was processed, would have had access to information about the actual gold content versus what was officially reported. Any significant discrepancy would have caught his attention. So you decided to kill him," Jeremiah said quietly. "We decided to eliminate a problem," Calkins corrected. "Samuel was getting too close to the truth, asking too many questions. Clayton came up with the plan: stage a robbery, pin it on Samuel, then have someone reliable clean up the mess." "Someone reliable," Jeremiah repeated, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "You mean me?" "You were perfect," Calkins said with cruel satisfaction. "War hero with a reputation for justice, but drink-addled enough to act on incomplete information. All we had to do was point you in Samuel's direction and let your conscience do the rest." The manipulation was more complete than Jeremiah had imagined. Not only had he been used as a weapon, but his own moral certainty, his belief in justice and law, had been turned against him. The men who should have been protecting the community had used his honor as a tool for murder. The bank robbery was staged. Isaiah asked. "Every detail," Calkins confirmed. "Clayton's idea, start to finish. We needed a crime serious enough to justify killing Samuel, so we robbed our own bank, killed poor Williams to make it look real, then spread the word that Samuel Hayes was our prime suspect." The deputy, who had remained silent throughout the interrogation, finally spoke up. "Sheriff, maybe you should stop talking." "Shut up, Morrison!" Calkins snapped. "These people are going to be dead before noon anyway. Might as well let them understand how completely they've been outplayed." But Morrison's nervous glance toward the mountain trail suggested that the deputy was having second thoughts about the whole situation. Unlike Calkins, he might not be willing to participate in the murder of children, regardless of what secrets needed protecting. Mary returned from the cabin with a small bundle of papers and belongings. "I got the directions," she said to Jeremiah, "and some other stuff Daddy said was important." Among the items was a small leather journal that Jeremiah recognized as the type used by mill workers to record daily operations. Samuel had apparently been keeping detailed notes about the discrepancies he'd discovered, documenting dates, amounts, and patterns that would have made it impossible for the theft to continue undetected. "This is what he died for," Isaiah said, flipping through pages of careful notations. Samuel was building a case, collecting evidence to present to the territorial authorities. "Fat lot of good it did him," Calkins said with bitter satisfaction. We made sure the territorial governor understood that Samuel Hayes was a dangerous criminal. By the time your brother died, his reputation was already destroyed. But as Jeremiah studied the journal more closely, he realized that Samuel's methodical documentation went far beyond simple record-keeping. The dead man had been building a comprehensive case that implicated not just local officials, but territorial appointees as well. If this evidence reached the right authorities, honest ones, it could bring down a corruption network that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. "We need to get to that mine shaft," Jeremiah said, making his decision. "If Samuel hid additional evidence there, we'll have everything we need to expose this conspiracy." "And if it's a trap?" Isaiah asked practically. "If Marsh has figured out what we're doing and is waiting for us?" "Then we spring it on our terms rather than his," Jeremiah replied, surprised by how naturally tactical thinking came back to him. "But first, we need to decide what to do with our prisoners." The deputy, Morrison, had been listening to the conversation with growing unease. Now he spoke up hesitantly. "Look, I don't know anything about stolen gold or conspiracies. I just took this job to feed my family. If there's been wrongdoing, I want no part of it." Colkins turned on his subordinate with venomous anger. "You gutless fool. You think they're going to let you walk away? You know too much now. I don't know anything." Morrison protested. "I never knew about any theft or murder plots. I just followed orders and kept my mouth shut when you told me to." The deputy's fear was genuine, and Jeremiah found himself believing the man's protests of ignorance. Morrison might have been willfully blind to his superior's corruption, but that was different from active participation in murder. "Here's what's going to happen," Jeremiah said, addressing Morrison directly. "You're going to ride back to town and spread the word that Sheriff Colkins has been arrested for the murder of Samuel Hayes and conspiracy to steal territorial funds. Tell them that federal marshals are on their way to investigate." "Federal marshals?" Morrison looked confused. "A lie," Isaiah said quietly, understanding Jeremiah's strategy. "But it might buy us time if Marsh thinks outside authorities are involved. What about Colkins?" Morrison asked, glancing at his bound superior. "He comes with us," Jeremiah replied grimly. "Insurance, and a witness to his own crimes." As they prepared to move out, Moses approached Jeremiah with his father's pocket watch in his small hands. "Mr. Stone," he said formally, "I think Daddy would want you to carry this now. You're going to finish what he started." The offer was both humbling and terrifying. Taking Samuel's watch would mean accepting full responsibility for the mission that had cost the man his life. But looking into Moses's trusting eyes, Jeremiah realized he had no choice. These children had already lost their father to the corruption he was trying to expose. They deserved to see that sacrifice honored. "I'll bring it back to you," he promised, accepting the watch with trembling hands. "When this is all over, it belongs with Samuel's family." "No, sir," Moses said with quiet wisdom. "It belongs with whoever's going to keep fighting for what's right." "Daddy would say that's more important than blood." The trust implicit in the boy's words was overwhelming. Here was Samuel Hayes' son, giving his father's most precious possession to the man who had killed him, because he understood that redemption sometimes required terrible choices and that justice mattered more than revenge. As they saddled horses and prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, Jeremiah found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 3 years ago, he'd been a guilt-ridden exile, hiding from the world and from himself. Now he wore a sheriff's badge and carried a dead man's watch, preparing to risk everything to expose the truth about crimes he'd unwittingly helped commit. The rifle he strapped to his saddle was the same weapon that had ended Samuel Hayes' life. Today, God willing, it would serve justice instead of corruption. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. The children who had forgiven their father's killer, the brother who had overcome his own guilt to help them, and the killer himself, finally ready to face the truth about what he'd done and why. But as they rode down the mountain trail toward an uncertain confrontation with dangerous men, Jeremiah understood that redemption was never guaranteed. They might succeed in exposing the conspiracy, or they might simply become 3 more victims of a corruption that had already claimed too many lives. The only certainty was that they had chosen to fight rather than hide, to seek truth rather than accept lies. The morning sun climbed higher as they descended towards Cedar Ridge, and with each mile the stakes grew clearer. This wasn't just about vindicating Samuel Hayes or satisfying their own need for justice. It was about protecting future victims, about ensuring that corrupt men couldn't continue to profit from murder and theft, about making sure that two brave children could grow up in a world where truth mattered more than power. Behind them, the mountain peaks stood like silent sentinels, witnesses to countless human dramas of courage and cowardice, love and loss. Ahead lay the valley where Samuel Hayes had lived and died, where his children had been orphaned, where justice had been perverted into its opposite. And somewhere in that valley, hidden in an abandoned mine shaft, lay the evidence that could set everything right if they lived long enough to find it. The weight of Samuel's watch in Jeremiah's pocket felt like a heartbeat, steady and determined. For the first time in 3 years, he was riding toward danger instead of away from it, carrying hope instead of guilt, fighting for something greater than his own tormented conscience. Whether he deserved this chance at redemption hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that Moses and Mary Hayes believed he did, and that their faith had given him the courage to become the man their father would have wanted him to be. The old mine shaft lay hidden behind Cedar Ridge's small cemetery, exactly where Mary's memory had placed it. As they approached through the afternoon shadows, Jeremiah could see why Samuel had chosen this location for hiding his evidence. It was remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but close enough to town that he could access it without arousing suspicion. The cemetery itself told the story of frontier hardship in weathered headstones and simple wooden crosses. Samuel Hayes's grave was marked with a modest stone that bore only his name, dates, and the words, "Beloved Father." Someone, probably Martha Henley, had placed fresh wildflowers on the site, a small gesture of remembrance in a place where the dead were too often forgotten. Moses and Mary stood silently before their father's grave, their small hands clasped together. Neither child cried, but Jeremiah could see the weight of loss in their rigid postures, the careful control that children learn when grief becomes too large for tears. "We're going to make this right." "Daddy," Moses whispered to the headstone, "we're going to tell everyone the truth about what happened." Behind them, Calkins struggled against his bonds, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You're all going to die for this," he snarled. "Clayton's got men watching every approach to town. You'll never make it out alive." "Maybe not," Isaiah replied calmly, checking the ropes that secured their prisoner. "But the truth will survive, even if we don't." The mineshaft entrance was partially concealed by fallen timber and accumulated debris, but Mary led them directly to a specific section of rotting planks. "Daddy showed me right here," she said, pointing to markings that were invisible to adult eyes, but clear to a child who had been taught to remember. "He said to count 3 boards from the big rock, then look for the place where somebody carved a little bird." Sure enough, scratched into the weathered wood was a crude but recognizable outline of a bird in flight. Samuel's marker, placed where only his children would think to look for it. Jeremiah pried away the loose boards, revealing a dark opening that disappeared into the mountain's depths. The smell that emerged was musty and cold, the scent of a place that had been sealed away from the world for years. But there was something else, the faint odor of oiled leather and preserved paper that suggested Samuel's cache had remained undisturbed. "I'll go," Jeremiah said. But Isaiah placed a restraining hand on his arm. "We go together," the bigger man said firmly. "Those children have lost enough family members to this mess. Neither of us is going into that mine alone." They fashioned torches from pine branches and rags soaked in lamp oil, creating flickering circles of light that pushed back the underground darkness. The mine shaft was deeper than expected, carved into solid rock by men who had chased veins of silver and gold into the mountain's heart. Water dripped steadily from unseen heights, and their footsteps echoed in the confined space like gunshots, 50 yards into the tunnel. Mary's directions led them to a side passage that opened into a natural cave. Here, protected from weather and time, Samuel Hayes had created his secret archive. Metal boxes wrapped in oiled canvas contained documents, photographs, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of the conspiracy that had cost him his life. "My God," Isaiah breathed, examining papers by torchlight. Samuel documented everything: dates, amounts, names. He even managed to get photographs of them moving the stolen gold. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Shipping manifests showed discrepancies between what was sent from the mines and what arrived at territorial warehouses. Bank records revealed deposits that matched the missing amounts precisely. And most damning of all were letters between Marsh and territorial officials, discussing their scheme to replace gold with lead weights and pocket the difference. But as they gathered the evidence, a sound from outside the mine made them freeze. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats, many riders moving fast. Calkins began laughing, a sound made horrible by its echoing multiplication in the confined space. "Too late," he called out gleefully. "Clayton's boys are here, and they've got you trapped like rats in a hole." Through the mine entrance came an ominous glow. Torchlight, but not the warm yellow of pine pitch. This was the harsh red-orange of burning brands. And with it came the acrid smell of coal oil and the crackle of flames being fed with accelerant. "They're going to burn us out," Isaiah said grimly, understanding immediately what was happening outside. The plan was brutally simple. Clayton Marsh's men would seal the mine entrance with fire, creating a furnace that would consume everything inside. No evidence would survive, no witnesses would remain to testify. And the official story would be that dangerous fugitives had died in an unfortunate accident while hiding in an abandoned mine. But as the smoke began to thicken and the temperature in the cave started to rise, Moses Hayes stepped forward with his father's journal clutched against his chest. The boy's face was calm, almost serene, as if he'd found peace with whatever was about to happen. "We got to save Daddy's papers," he said simply. "Even if we can't get out, somebody's got to know the truth." The courage of a 6-year-old child, facing death with dignity his father would have recognized, shamed both men into action. They might die in this mountain tomb, but they would die fighting. And somehow, God willing, the truth Samuel Hayes had died protecting would survive to see justice done. Outside, the burning had begun, and with it came the sound of men's voices, confident and cruel, celebrating what they believed would be the final chapter in their conspiracy of murder and theft. But they had underestimated the determination of 2 children who had already lost everything. One brother who had learned too late what family truly meant, and one guilt-ridden killer who had finally found something worth dying for. The smoke was getting thicker, but Jeremiah had noticed something that Marsh's men had missed. The cave where Samuel's evidence was hidden had a second opening. Years of mountain living had taught him to read air currents, and he could feel a slight breeze coming from deeper in the cave system, suggesting another way out. "There's a back exit," he told Isaiah urgently. "Help me gather everything we can carry." They worked quickly, stuffing Samuel's documents and photographs into their coat pockets and saddlebags while the smoke grew denser. Moses and Mary helped without complaint, their small hands surprisingly efficient as they rolled papers and secured loose items. Even Calkins, faced with the prospect of burning alive, had stopped his taunting and begun to look genuinely frightened. The back passage was narrow and treacherous, requiring them to crawl through sections where the ceiling dropped to barely shoulder height. But it led steadily upward, away from the smoke and heat of the burning mine entrance. Behind them, they could hear the roar of flames and the occasional crash of timber as the fire consumed everything combustible. They emerged, gasping and soot-covered, from a hidden opening nearly a quarter-mile from the cemetery. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the glow from the burning mine. From their elevated position, they could see Marsh's men gathered around the flames, confident that their work was nearly finished. "Now what?" Isaiah asked quietly, checking their small arsenal of weapons. "We've got the evidence, but we're outnumbered 10-1. Jeremiah studied the scene below, his military training automatically calculating angles and possibilities. Marsh's men were spread out but relaxed, believing their enemies were trapped and dying. They had made the classic mistake of celebrating victory before it was complete. "We don't need to fight them all," he said finally. "We just need to get to town and present this evidence to people who will listen. Martha Henley, Pastor Williams, some of the honest merchants, there are good people in Cedar Ridge who'll stand up for justice if they know the truth." But as they began to move carefully down the mountainside, keeping to the shadows and avoiding open ground, a new sound made them freeze. More riders were approaching from the direction of town, but these weren't Marsh's men. The lead rider carried a torch, and in its light they could see the determined face of Martha Henley, followed by a dozen townspeople armed with rifles and grim expressions. "Martha," Mary whispered, her face lighting up with hope. The approaching group had apparently seen the smoke and flames from town and come to investigate. As they drew closer to Marsh's men, angry voices began to carry on the evening air. "Clayton Marsh!" Martha's voice rang out with righteous fury. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Marsh himself rode forward to meet the townspeople, his face a mask of practiced innocence. "Martha, thank God you're here. We've cornered the men who killed Sheriff Calkins. They're trapped in that mine shaft, and we're smoking them out." "Calkins is dead," someone called out. "Murdered in cold blood by that mountain man Stone and Samuel Hayes's brother," Marsh replied smoothly. "They've been plotting this for weeks, planning to frame innocent citizens for their own crimes." The lie was beautifully crafted, turning the truth completely upside down. But Martha Henley was not easily deceived, and her sharp eyes had noticed details that others missed. "If Calkins is dead," she said coldly, "why is that his horse tied up with yours? And why does it look like that fire was set deliberately rather than accidentally?" Marsh's confident expression faltered slightly. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you're a liar and a murderer," Martha interrupted, her voice carrying across the valley like a bell. "And I'm suggesting that those people in that mine shaft are the ones trying to expose your crimes." The confrontation between the two groups was electric with tension. Some of the townspeople seemed uncertain, caught between conflicting versions of truth. But others, those who had known and respected Samuel Hayes, who had seen how his children were treated, began to nod in agreement with Martha's accusations. It was at this moment that Jeremiah made his decision. Standing up from his concealment, he called out in his strongest voice, "Martha's right. I'm Sheriff Stone now, and I'm placing Clayton Marsh under arrest for the murder of Samuel Hayes and theft of territorial funds." The effect of his appearance was dramatic. Marsh's men reached for their weapons, but several townspeople immediately leveled their rifles in response. The standoff balanced on a knife's edge, with violence seeming inevitable. But then Moses and Mary Hayes stepped out from behind Jeremiah, their small figures clearly visible in the firelight. The sight of the two children, alive, unharmed, and standing bravely beside their protectors, sent a ripple of shock through both groups. "Those are Samuel's children," someone whispered. "They're alive," another voice said with amazement. Moses stepped forward, holding his father's journal high above his head where everyone could see it. His young voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "We got our daddy's words right here," he called out. "He wrote down all the truth about who the real bad men are, and now everybody's going to know." The simple courage of a 6-year-old boy, standing up to armed men in defense of his dead father's memory, broke through years of lies and corruption like sunlight through storm clouds. Even some of Marsh's own men began to lower their weapons, unwilling to participate in violence against children who had already suffered so much. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Colorado Territory, bringing with it new growth and the promise of fresh beginnings. The wildflowers on Samuel Hayes's grave were blooming again, tended now not by charity but by love, the love of children who finally understood that their father had been a hero, not a criminal. The federal investigation that followed that dramatic night had been swift and thorough. Samuel's carefully documented evidence, combined with testimony from repentant accomplices and the discovery of stolen gold hidden in Clayton Marsh's property, had exposed a corruption network that reached into the territorial government itself. Marsh and several associates were now serving long prison sentences, while Sheriff Calkins had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony against higher-ranking conspirators. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. It lived in the laughter of two children who no longer had to carry the shame of their father's alleged crimes, in the restored reputation of a good man who had died trying to do right, and in the quiet satisfaction of justice finally served. Jeremiah stood on the porch of his cabin, enlarged now to accommodate a proper family, watching Moses and Mary play in the meadow below. The boy was teaching his sister to whittle, just as Samuel had once taught him, while she patiently corrected his letters when he stumbled over the words in her primer. They had grown in the months since that terrible night, not just in size, but in confidence and joy. The haunted look had finally faded from their eyes, replaced by the bright curiosity that belonged to children who felt safe in the world. The badge he'd worn that night was gone now, returned to proper authorities, along with his report on the conspiracy. He was no longer Sheriff Stone, just Jeremiah, adoptive father to two remarkable children, friend to their uncle Isaiah, and finally, after 3 years of self-imposed exile, a man at peace with his place in the world. Isaiah had kept his word about staying close to family. He'd purchased a small ranch in the valley, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to give the children's new family space to grow. The brothers-in-law had become genuine friends, bonded by their shared love for Samuel's memory and their determination to give Moses and Mary the life their father had dreamed of for them. Martha Henley had become an unofficial grandmother, arriving weekly with fresh bread, sage advice, and the kind of fierce maternal love that had made her such a champion for the children from the beginning. She'd been instrumental in the legal proceedings that had officially made Jeremiah their guardian, navigating territorial bureaucracy with the same determination she'd shown in confronting armed criminals. But it was the children themselves who had worked the greatest transformation. Living with Moses and Mary had taught Jeremiah that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering. It was something you received through service, through choosing to do better rather than simply feeling bad about past failures. They had forgiven him not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness was in their nature, a gift from their father's teaching and their own remarkable spirits. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his reverie. A lone rider was coming up the mountain trail, and Jeremiah's hand moved automatically toward his rifle before he recognized the visitor. Deputy Morrison, now serving as the territory's appointed interim sheriff, dismounted with the careful movements of someone bearing important news. "Afternoon, Jeremiah," Morrison said, accepting the offered cup of coffee. "Got word from Denver today. The territorial governor wants to offer you the permanent sheriff's position for this district. Seems they're impressed with how you handled the Marsh investigation." The offer wasn't entirely unexpected. There had been hints and suggestions for months, but hearing it made official force Jeremiah to confront questions he'd been avoiding. "I'm not sure I'm the right man for that job," he said honestly. "I've got a family to raise now, and I'm not sure how Moses and Mary would feel about their father living a lawman's life again." "Why don't you ask them?" Morrison suggested with a smile, nodding toward the meadow where the children had stopped their play to watch the adult conversation. Moses approached with the direct purposefulness that was becoming his trademark. At 7 now, he was growing into the intelligent, serious young man his father would have been proud of. The pocket watch, Samuel's watch, hung from a chain at his vest, keeping perfect time once again after Jeremiah had it repaired in Denver. "Were you and Sheriff Morrison talking about the job offer?" Moses asked with the straightforward manner that never failed to amaze adults. "How did you know about that?" Jeremiah replied, "People talk," Mary said, joining her brother with Hope the rag doll tucked under her arm. Miss Martha says the territory needs good lawmen, and that you'd be real good at keeping bad people from hurting innocent folks. The children's faith in his ability to serve justice was both humbling and inspiring. But more than that, it was practical. They understood better than most adults the importance of having honest people in positions of authority. What do you think? Jeremiah asked them seriously. Would you be comfortable with me wearing a badge again? Moses considered the question with the gravity of a much older person. Daddy always said that good men got to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. If you being sheriff helps protect families like ours, then that's what you should do. Mary nodded her agreement, then added with 6-year-old practicality, besides, we'd still live here on the mountain, right? This is our home now. Looking at their faces, trusting, loving, completely confident in his judgment, Jeremiah felt the last of his guilt finally lifting away like morning mist. These children had given him more than forgiveness. They had given him a future worth building, a purpose worth serving, and most importantly, a family worth protecting. Tell the governor I accept, he said to Morrison. But I want it understood that my family comes first, always. As the sun set over the Colorado peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Jeremiah sat on his porch with Moses and Mary on either side of him. The boy was reading aloud from a book of frontier stories, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. The girl was working on a new doll for herself, her stitches neat and careful, her concentration complete. In the distance, Isaiah was riding up from his ranch for their weekly dinner together, probably carrying fresh news from town and stories from his own growing family. Martha would arrive soon, with her weekly offering of food and fellowship. Their small mountain community was complete, bound together by love rather than blood, by choice rather than chance. Samuel Hayes's pocket watch ticked steadily in Moses's vest, marking time not as something lost, but as something precious to be cherished. And somewhere in the evening breeze that stirred the pine trees, Jeremiah could almost hear an echo of approval from the man whose death had brought them all together, a father's blessing on the unlikely family that had grown from tragedy and forgiveness. The mountain man who had killed their father had become their protector. The orphaned children had become his redemption. And in the miracle of that transformation, all of them had found their way home.